I think, if we're thinking maybe just specifically about the fashion context, thinking about my personal background, I found it really interesting how, for the most part, everybody has a very kind of muted colour palette. Everyone's wearing very much kind of greys and beiges, and it has that real contrast with those flashes of red that come through, particularly when you see the boy's face. And also, it's quite interesting, the only other time you see red in that kind of fashion context is the little boy's hat, which kind of aligns him with the man who was his stepfather, but was saying he was somebody else, and trying not to get people mixed up. So I found that idea of contrast really quite striking. And I think that kind of idea of kind of greyness makes it both very relatable, something that's very everyday, and something which is almost quite mundane. This is something that actually seems quite extraordinary, but could actually happen to anyone anywhere, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating film, and thank you for your fascinating comments as well. That's really interesting to hear about the sort of the colour palette and the sartorial choices. And I think this is something perhaps you can also expand on as well. But in just thinking about the costumes, I thought it was very interesting the sort of the main character, the lawyer of Kido-san, Kido-sensei, as he was known, and you know, the way he dressed in this sort of this dark coat suit that he pretty much wore the whole time, except when he was in his family, you know, home environment. And I think you see it right at the end as well with the painting, and he's got his back, and it's also almost like they're kind of collapsed into each other, these different identities, the way he has tried to sort of assimilate, so that he's almost sort of, he almost, for me, reflects what anyone wants to see, you know, the way he's able to sort of, and at the end we see in that final scene where he's almost like taking on these different layers of personalities and inhabiting them himself in that sort of little sort of scene where he's, you know, pretending to be, you know, is he pretending to be the real Daisuke or the fake Daisuke, you know. So that was really fascinating, but then at the end when we see him with that painting, which is also quite a fascinating painting in itself, by Magritte, the French painter, you know, where we see the back of a man looking in a mirror, but we don't see his face. And obviously there is this, you know, repetition of this theme of, you know, we see a few sketches where the face is obscured. So it's almost like we're always trying to sort of, you know, see through to that person and their identity, but we never quite manage it, you know. But I think, you know, Kido, I don't know if you can say anything more about the way he dressed, and, you know, obviously on the one hand he's a lawyer, and lawyers do tend to kind of dress quite like, you know, formally, particularly in Japan, and but still the way, you know, he was very cool as well, wasn't he? But just kind of almost in some ways blending in, assimilating, and obviously that leads into his own personal background in his history that he's almost trying to kind of overcome, being a Zainichi Korean, or you know, a resident Korean, and you know, obviously he's a third generation, they say in the film, so he's, you know, he has, as you know, the way he's concerned, he's a Japanese. You know, he says he's a Japanese. You know, he has a Japanese name. He's been there. You know, he's a third generation. He's become this highly, you know, respected member of society, which is what you are told that's what you're supposed to do in Japan, and this is how you will gain respect and membership of the community. And he's done everything he can do, and yet still, you know, this sort of lingering discrimination that hasn't gone away. So obviously, if, you know, I'm not going to go deeply into the history, but obviously at the sort of the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Japan was engaged in this project of imperialism, colonialization, and obviously, you know, Korea was, you know, a place that Japan saw, you know, for its expansion of its empire. And so at this time you get this migration sort of, I mean, you know, between Japan and Korea, and also Taiwan, China. So you have, Koreans coming to Japan, as colonial subjects, and so you have, during the sort of the early 20th century, going into the sort of war period, you have Korean migration, Korean communities in Japan, and following the end of the Second World War, although many did return to Korea, you also had this continuing population that remained in Japan, but they were not initially allowed to have full Japanese citizenship. They were resident there, but they didn't have, they weren't Japanese and they weren't seen as Japanese. They didn't have the full rights. So you have this community, and they tended to sort of work, live in certain areas and engage in certain occupations that were, working class occupations. And so you had this sort of, lingering discrimination against these, Koreans that were, not necessarily welcomed, but then there was nowhere for them to go. I think also still trying to make this serious point, I think there's later in the film, there is a scene where he's watching the TV and there's this, I don't know, it's a news report or a documentary where they're talking about these issues of, anti-immigrant feeling, discrimination against, and it's something that's continuing, and even now you see there are certain elements in Japan, right-wing nationalist elements who would like to rewrite Japan's history, particularly to do with, wartime events, and, Japan is, seen generally as the aggressor, in East Asia at that time, and, there are many, maybe I shouldn't say many, but there is a contingent in Japan, right-wing nationalists, that would like to rewrite history.
So one of the things that I found quite interesting looking into Ishikawa's history really is that originally he actually studied physics. He was a physicist at Tohoku University, and he then changed paths, so a little bit like the film that we've seen, he's also changed his own direction, and he decided to study film at the National Film School in Poland. So I found it quite interesting, and now you think back on it, when you mentioned about the suiting that Kido-san's wearing, it's very much kind of fitting into that kind of archetypal, almost kind of shadowy detective figure almost, like not so much the kind of, Mac and a hat type thing, but that kind of almost anonymised, kind of quite slick but anonymised figure. And I think that really kind of fits into European ideas of what a detective film looks like.
It's sort of saying, when we fall in love, what it is about the other person we fall in love with? What if the person we fall in love with turns out to be someone completely different? What if the hidden past harbors the most unexpected secret? And when we hate someone, what is it about the other that we hate? Can we hate the person entire being just by examining one side of them, or a small incident from the past? This profound question, along with the question of who am I, is one that has tormented me for long. And in today's world, where intolerance and isolation abound, I feel the question is not mere personal problem.
I thought it was a beautiful film, so well selected, South Social Film Festival, and so layered and intriguing and mannered, and the subtlety of it. And I liked the contrast between the loving relationships, which are so understated. It's a sort of antidote to the Hollywood three-act structure where everyone's saying, "Daddy, I love you," or really, it's, you really don't see that much even physical contact. The intimacy is created in different ways, and I thought that was very interesting. And with regard to kind of racism and immigration, that's a feeling all around the world. But there's also that scene when they're having dinner and the so-called, he sort of undermines the respectability, the conceit of the respectability. And so we're presented with this sort of bourgeoisie dinner party, and the father's sounding off about a whole group of people, they're all on welfare and blah, blah, blah. And obviously, Japanese culture is very complicated with its history in the Second World War, where Germany has done a lot of apologising and soul-searching, and the Japanese culture has not really included that. I mean, it's still, like England, an island, imperial, with a monarchy. So I'm quite obsessed by what they see as politeness as well, what's expected of you. So I thought the comparisons, the kind of contrasts and comparisons were very impactful. And I can see a Hollywood remake happening, but it would be a travesty. It would be an absolute travesty. Because I like the way it ended on an ambivalent note. So we don't really know what happens next, and we don't really know what happiness is, because it's a catalogue of loss for the main protagonist, the wife, her child, and the rest of it. Anyway, it's a beautiful film, so thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, Lois, have you got...
I had a little thought about that dinner scene, actually. You just reminded me, and I absolutely agree. I think there's so many, quite frankly, universal things in there that you've really perfectly picked up on. But the bit I'd like to speak about that dinner scene is when they say to Kido-san, they say, "Oh, we don't mean you." And then the mother replies, "Oh, yes, I love those Korean dramas." And I think that's something that sadly is also very universal. There's this idea you have K-pop, you have K-dramas, hugely popular Korean artwork going all around the world now. And a little bit like in kind of European and American context, just because somebody's kind of popular culture product is accepted doesn't mean that those people from that background is. And I think sadly that's something that the whole world needs to work on.
My background is that I did my PhD looking at representations of single mothers, so it's very relevant to this this film here. So sort of just to sort of explain slightly with the situation in Japan. Generally, there's no legally there's no joint custody. So when a couple break up and there are children involved, one of the parents has to take the children. And also probably I should explain is when they get married, Japanese people have to take one surname, and it's usually the husband's surname, so you can't have separate surnames. So the wife will have, certainly in this situation, which is the norm, the wife will, on marriage, will have taken her husband's surname, and the whole family would share that name. And if they break up, and let's say in more than 80% of cases, the mother gets sole custody of the child, and so there's like this break, and the children she will go back to revert to her pre-married name unless she remarries, and then the children will take her name. They're living in her household. The father is living in a separate household, and often, as it wasn't quite clear, but it was kind of intimated that once his parents divorced, so in some way he does have a biological father, but we never saw him, right? He's hardly, not referenced at all, and he no longer has a relationship, presumably, with that father, which also is fairly common in Japan, that they, once the couple is split up, the non-custodial parent often will not have a relationship. Often they don't even contribute financially. So the mother, in this case, it was single mother, and that is the norm, but the mother would have sole responsibility. It's like a complete, and it's been referred to as a sort of a clean break scenario in Japan. Like that's what they prefer. That once you've left the family, you've left not just your spouse but the children. You've left them, and there's a clean break, and that's in some ways considered to be sort of easier than continuing to have a relationship with that parent, even though the parent is not, with you full time. I'm sure there's all sorts of debates we could have about whether that is, the best way or not. But that is generally what happens in Japan. So you've got this situation where that boy, obviously, initially he has his father's name, and then they divorce, and he reverts to his mother's name, and then she remarries, so he takes on, the new father's name. So it's a bit of an unusual situation because there's not so, remarriage after divorce is not as common for women in Japan. But certainly, those things do happen where names will go back and forth. But yeah, it's this, as the boy says himself, what's my name? Who am I? Who do I become? Because, as we, one of the main themes in the film is this sort of idea of inherited shame or inherited, citizenship, inherited, and that the fact, this idea that what we take, we have this burden that we carry on from our parents, particularly sort of fathers. So we take on their name, but we take on more than that. There is everything that's implied in that as well.
How do you understand the sentence that the criminal said somebody's life can be up to 300 years? Can I get your view on that? Thank you.
I mean, perhaps we can look at it from the point of view of sort of this idea of inheritance and carrying on the family line and the family name. The lawyer also seemed very perplexed as well, so I don't know if you have any ideas, Lois?
It made me think a little bit, like, Ben, I'm the same as you. Is it a case that is it about 300 years of somebody's lineage? Was it something like that? I wondered if possibly it was derived from a saying which he assumed that because he was a Korean he wouldn't understand, he wouldn't have inherited the knowledge of that saying coming down, possibly. The other thing I wondered is, as it's later revealed after that, he's on a misplaced identity. Is it that identity's been used 300 times? Is it a case that one person, one identity lives on forever because it keeps on being run through this washing machine cycle?
Somehow, and I don't know how, unless he looked it up, but he knew that the lawyer had this Korean ancestry. And I wonder, it's like, you've got 300 years before you can, you'll always be Korean, kind of trying to sort of remind him of his roots and the fact that you're never going to escape that. You'll have to wait 300 years if you want to escape that, because, as far as he's concerned, you'll always be Korean is what I felt like he was saying, and that, you're no better than me kind of thing, you're a fraudster like I am.
It's less of a question, more of an observation, but going back to that dinner party scene and the comment that you were just making about inherited shame was quite interesting, because I think thinking about Zainichi Korean in Japan, and kind of in a way it's like the stepdad in that scene is kind of not inheriting the shame of the national shame of that relationship, and actually that kind of the shame of the identity is actually being passed on to Zainichi Koreans in Japan, where they are then feeling ashamed of their heritage and their identity because, of a lot of reasons, I suppose. But it's just funny the kind of hypocrisy that comes out there with that shame being passed on to actually the victim of the exploitative relationship. That's all. It wasn't really a question.
No, it's a really insightful point. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, it's probably more of an observation. I just wondered about that scene, which was really striking, the art exhibition and the idea of the prisoners on death row in Japan, and the idea that they've committed terrible crimes, but the art is proof that they've changed, and how much that is a symbol of the nation, that it did commit terrible crimes during World War II, but it has changed, it has become a modern nation. You still have the latent nationalism, but that's a very small part of what Japan is now. Whether that can be read as a representation of national change, because that theme of identity, which is, you get very immersed in the characterization of the individuals, but all the time the metaphor that it's about the nation as well. And I also was struck by the scene of the boy seeing the crime of the father, that confrontation, which was so visceral, but this is also can be read as a national form.
Yeah, thank you. And I think also that sort of leads into sort of this idea of trauma as well. Obviously, there are, that main character, the fake Daisuke, I think his name was Makoto in the end, wasn't it? And the trauma that he was experienced from that sort of formative, tragedy, that, terrible experience that he witnessed. and that you know, that trauma, you know, obviously never leaves him, and every time he looks in the mirror, he sees it, he relives it. So there is obviously this idea of this individual trauma, but also perhaps linking to the sort of national trauma as well.
I think that the art exhibition is a really great place to look at, actually, where you have the man that's hosting the exhibition saying, if you can't accept that someone can change, then you're automatically saying that the death penalty is right. So it's something that's very concrete. But I think the idea of change is something which is always possible. I think that's something that's always throughout that film. So yes, you can say Japan's changed, but then if you look at the attitudes which are being shown towards the Zainichi Korean character, you think, well, could it potentially change back again for the worse? So change is always a possibility, and it's not always for the better. But yeah, I absolutely agree with your observations.
Hello, I've got one question. Just wondering what's your thoughts on the end of the scene was in the bar where the lawyer was pretending to be Daisuke.
And for me, I'm seeing it as something that's very cyclical. So at the very beginning of the film, you see the Magritte painting of the faceless man, and then you see it set up almost, where they're in the bar, you see them both from the back, and then you see that painting again, and he's looking into the painting, he's directly analogised in that painting. So potentially, we don't know because he never actually says what name he's going to give, he's almost given a choice whether he wants to break that cycle or not. Does he want to start this laundering cycle again, or does he want to go back to his same life? And so for me, it's a degree of choice. It's about the idea of agency, that you can pick who you are. That is something that's possible and it's doable. And you know, you can get help with that if you're particularly in the Japanese context. And also that you can continue that cycle or you can break it. So that's how I personally read it. It's not something that I've specifically seen. I think that it's something which is down to interpretation. It is something that crossed my mind, particularly when I saw those scenes with the red, where you have the red lighting, which symbolises the blood and the rage and the anger, and obviously red is a colour right in the middle of the Japanese flag. So it's an analogy you can fairly easily make. But on the other hand, which is one of the parts of the background that I found really interesting myself, is in interviews with the director, he specifically says, yes, okay, it's a story in Japan, but it doesn't mean that the story is something uniquely Japanese. It's something that you can adapt to kind of a global context, and that's something I do agree with. But I think genuinely that I don't know specifically if that was his intention, but I can easily see how it could be read that way too.
So thank you so much, because it's been really a pleasure again, and you're just so, great clarification, like great, just going inside the subject and everything. Please, big round of applause for Lois and for